The Cold War was a time of intense rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both superpowers sought to expand their spheres of influence, often backing opposing sides in regional conflicts. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, hoping to prop up a communist government. This intervention would prove to be a costly miscalculation, dragging Moscow into a decade-long conflict. The United States, seeing an opportunity to bleed its rival, launched Operation Cyclone. This covert program, orchestrated by the CIA, funneled billions of dollars in arms and training to Afghan resistance groups known as the Mujahideen. The United States' strategy was two-pronged. First, it sought to inflict a humiliating defeat on the Soviet Union, bogging it down in a protracted and unwinnable war. Second, Washington aimed to stem the tide of communism, preventing its spread into strategically important regions like South Asia and the Middle East. The CIA, working with Pakistan's Inter-Services Intelligence, channeled weapons and funds to various Mujahideen factions. The U.S. favored groups with a reputation for ferocity and a willingness to fight the Soviets. The US-backed Mujahideen, armed with sophisticated weaponry like Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, proved to be a formidable fighting force. They inflicted heavy casualties on Soviet forces, ultimately forcing Moscow to withdraw from Afghanistan in 1989. The US declared Operation Cyclone a resounding success, a testament to the effectiveness of covert action in rolling back Soviet influence. However, this victory would prove to be short-lived and would come at a steep price. The US, in its zeal to defeat the Soviets, had armed and empowered a disparate collection of militant groups with little regard for their ideology or long-term goals. The influx of weapons into Afghanistan, coupled with the absence of a cohesive post-Soviet political order, plunged the country into chaos. Various Mujahideen factions, once united by their opposition to the Soviet occupation, turned on each other, vying for power and control. This power vacuum created fertile ground for extremism to flourish. Among the Mujahideen groups supported by the US was a young Saudi jihadist named Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden, inspired by the Afghan resistance against the Soviets, went on to found Al-Qaeda, a global terrorist organization that would later target the United States itself. In the aftermath of the Soviet withdrawal, Afghanistan descended into a brutal civil war. The Mujahideen, fragmented and riven by internal divisions, failed to establish a stable government. Amidst the chaos and lawlessness, a new force emerged, the Taliban. This austere Islamic movement, composed largely of former Mujahideen fighters, promised to restore order and impose a strict interpretation of Islamic law. The Taliban, with their roots in the very insurgency that the US had supported, rapidly gained control of most of Afghanistan. The Taliban's rise to power had profound implications for global terrorism. The group provided safe haven to Al-Qaeda, allowing it to establish training camps and plan attacks against Western targets. Under the Taliban's protection, Al-Qaeda flourished, attracting recruits from across the Muslim world and evolving into a transnational terrorist organization. The 9/11 attacks, orchestrated by Al-Qaeda from its bases in Afghanistan, were a stark reminder of the unintended consequences of US actions during the Cold War. The legacy of Operation Cyclone continues to haunt US foreign policy today. The US intervention in Afghanistan, initially intended to counter Soviet influence, inadvertently contributed to the rise of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. This cycle of interventions backfiring has repeated in other contexts, most notably in Syria. In its efforts to topple Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, the US once again found itself providing support to armed groups, some of which had links to extremist organizations. While the US claimed to be backing moderate rebels, the lines between these groups and more radical factions often blurred. The Syrian conflict, much like the Afghan war before it, illustrates the dangers of unintended consequences in foreign policy. The US, in its quest to achieve short-term objectives, often overlooks the long-term implications of its actions. This myopic approach can create power vacuums that are exploited by extremist groups, leading to greater instability and violence.